Johnson delivered the 1966 State of the Union on January 12.
History is on the side of freedom and is on the side of societies shaped from the genius of each people. History does not favor a single system or belief unless force is used to make it so. And that's why it's been necessary for us to defend this basic principle of our policy, to defend it in Berlin and in Korea and in Cuba and tonight in Vietnam. For tonight, as so many nights before, young Americans struggle and young Americans die in a distant land. Tonight, as so many nights before, the American nation is asked to sacrifice the blood of its children and the fruits of its labor for the love of its freedom. How many times in my lifetime and in yours have the American people gathered as they do now to hear their president tell them of conflict and tell them of danger? Each time they have answered. They've answered with all the effort that the security and the freedom of this nation required. And they do again tonight in Vietnam. Not too many years ago, Vietnam was a peaceful, if troubled land. In the north was an independent communist government. In the South, a people struggled to build a nation with the friendly help of the United States. There were some in South Vietnam who wished to force communist rule on their own people, but their progress was slight. Their hope of success was dim. Then, little more than 6 years ago, North Vietnam decided on conquest. And from that day to this, soldiers and supplies have moved from north to south in a swelling stream that's swallowing the remnants of revolution and aggression. And as the assault mounted, our choice gradually became clear. We could leave, abandoning South Vietnam to its attackers and to certain conquest, or we could stay and fight beside the people of South Vietnam. We stayed, and we will stay until and we will stay until aggression has stopped. We will stay because a just nation cannot leave to the cruelties of its enemies a people who have staked their lives and independence on America's solemn pledge, a pledge which has grown through the commitments of 3 American presidents. We will stay because in Asia and around the world are countries whose independence rests in large measure on confidence in America's word and in America's protection. To yield to force in Vietnam would weaken that confidence, would undermine the independence of many lands, and would whet the appetite of aggression. We would have to fight in one land, and then we'd have to fight in another, or abandon much of Asia to the domination of communism. And we do not intend to abandon Asia to conquest.
On January 28th, Radio Hanoi broadcast a letter Ho Chi Minh sent to heads of government and others interested in the Vietnam situation, denouncing the so-called search for peace, as he accused the other side of deceit and hypocrisy, and demanded the U.S. pull troops from Vietnam and accept the National Liberation Front as the sole genuine representative of the people of South Vietnam. 2 days later, former Vice President Nixon appeared on the program Issues and Answers, serving notice that Republicans plan to target Democratic congressmen and senators, taking what he called the appeasement line on Vietnam, calling their actions very irresponsible and detrimental to the cause of peace. When asked how his party would make Vietnam an issue when the leaders of his own party were supporting Johnson's policies, Nixon replied, "I hope it will not be an issue. It will become one only if President Johnson fails to take a strong line that will preserve the peace by refusing to reward the aggressors." On February 4th, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee began hearings on Vietnam. When asked if the hearings were helpful, Johnson replied, "I don't see that I would be the proper one to judge because I haven't had the intimacy with them that the members of the committee have. But that is a matter for the Senate to determine. I wouldn't find any fault with any committee having any hearings at any time, as long as they are conducted in an atmosphere of objectivity, fairness, and judiciousness. I have not observed that these have been conducted in any other manner, so far as I can see. They had Secretary Rusk for a while, and he is going to be appearing again, and General Taylor. They have had General Gavin. From what I read about him, his program or his testimony, and what I've seen about Mr. Kennens, I don't see that they have done any harm to anybody. I think it is a question for everyone fully exploring the problems that face our country coming up with the best recommendations and best programs they can. I have tried to take every recommendation submitted to me and carefully consider it and pursue it to the extent I thought justified. I will continue to do that. I welcome any suggestions any of you have. On February 4th, at a press conference, Johnson was asked if the resumption of India economic aid would be contingent on the visit of Gandhi. Johnson replying, "I wouldn't want to foreclose or preclude any allotments in between, but none have been made as of now. I would anticipate that she would be here in the reasonably near future. I am just passing on the most urgent at the moment, that is food. We have allotted 3.5 million tons already this fiscal year, and this will be an additional 3 million, 2 million of wheat and 1 million of maize. You can say that we are formulating legislation that we will discuss with the Indian government, but we are formulating legislation that will be discussed and debated and sent to the Congress unless we change our mind. That is our present plan, to ask for a commitment of the Congress and the American people, and to also use whatever influence we have, what leadership in the world, to ask other countries to come in and contribute. Now, in just what form we will do that is still in the detail state. I went into it last night, and I spent some time today with the Secretary of Agriculture on it, but he is going to be working on it today. In early 1966, the Republican National Committee held a meeting at the Washington Hilton Hotel. Vice President of the Opinion Research Corporation Thomas W. Benham admitted that Johnson's personal approval rating was only slightly lower from the previous year, and that his legislative record was high, but that fears of inflation, rising government spending, and a wider war were ever present. This formed the basis for the Republican strategy in the midterm election. What happened to the Democrats after the Korean War could happen to Johnson in Vietnam. As Johnson was still considered a strong leader and not directly up for re-election that year, the Republicans shifted to focusing on Democratic senators and congressmen at odds with Johnson's handling of the conflict so as to put them on the defensive in their respective re-election bids. On February 17th, Johnson delivered a speech at the annual presidential prayer breakfast, also attended by Reverend Billy Graham and Senator Frank Carlson. He concluded, "I am sustained by the prayers of hundreds of Americans who daily take the time to look up from their own problems in order to try to give me a little encouragement in mine. Not long ago, I received a letter one morning from a mother whose son had been killed in Vietnam. She spoke of the pain and the loss and the tears that are ever ready to flow. But through all of this were words of encouragement for me from this dear little lady." In her letter, she concluded, "Mr. President, I wish I could tell you all that I feel in my heart, but there just aren't words. So we ask God to bless you and your family, that He will guide you in all the terrible decisions that you must make. As long as we believe, our strength is in our faith in God, and He will never fail us." 2 days later, Senator Robert Kennedy said that with respect to discontent groups in South Vietnam, the United States had the option of killing or repressing them, relinquishing power, or admitting them to a share of power and responsibility. He advocated for the last option in the hopes of reaching a settlement, the position being notably a break not only with the Johnson administration, but also with Secretary of State Rusk and Defense Secretary McNamara, both of whom had been appointed by his brother. On February 21st, President de Gaulle told a press conference that he was going to end French participation in the military aspects of the NATO alliance, while retaining membership in the organization. By the end of February, over 4,300 American soldiers had died in Vietnam in the past 2 months, a sharp increase from the 7,000 Americans that had died there throughout the entirety of the previous year. The Viet Cong notably had 7,000 deaths in the same 2-month period and over 100 of its men captured. By March 1966, war critics had the better of the Vietnam argument. On March 10th, the Saigon government dismissed Thai and forced him to leave the government for a third of a year. While Johnson and his advisors accepted this without protest, Thai's dismissal sparked protests that included takeovers in Da Nang and Hue. This fallout both shook the president's confidence and increased his fears of communist gains. March 25th marked the first of 3 days of staged protest against the Vietnam War, planned by the National Coordinating Committee to End the War in Vietnam. Over 200 students at the University of Michigan staged a walk-in at the Ann Arbor Draft Board office, 3 people being charged by the police with disorderly conduct following a scuffle. At the Union Square rally, veterans of World War I, World War II, and the Korean War mounted a wood platform, using it to burn their discharge and separation papers over a makeshift stove. One demonstrator was Frank A. Kenny, who won a Bronze Star during World War II for aiding in destroying 3 German pillboxes near Aachen. He said, "If President Johnson can burn people, I can burn my discharge papers." The Reverend A.J. Musk defended veterans against criticism that their actions were hurting U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. It is not we who are injuring GIs. It is those elements who, through ignorance or a lack of commitment to human values, are betraying them. On April 2nd, Lodge agreed when asked by Kai to help suppress rebels in Dang and Hue with additional transport planes, Lodge being instructed by Johnson to keep our troops and equipment out of riot area. We don't want to become involved. Dalek writes that Johnson sought the embassy's help in arranging a solution to the crisis that was both quick and peaceful, ordering Lodge to have more contact with the GVN and opposing political elements. On April 8th, following a trip to Vietnam, Deputy Defense Secretary Cyrus Vance reported they were doing well militarily and are continuing to impose heavy losses on both the VC and North Vietnamese. Maxwell Taylor, seeking an expanded air war, told Johnson, "In the eyes of the Hanoi leaders, the ground war in South Vietnam must now appear to be going rather badly, and it is important that they receive an equally discouraging impression from the air war. Not until they get a gloomy composite from both is there much hope of bringing them to negotiations." On April 21st, Senator Fulbright of Arkansas delivered a speech at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies on the question of whether the U.S. could overcome the fatal arrogance of power that had destroyed great nations. He said, "My hope and my belief are that it can, that it has the human resources to accomplish what few, if any, great nations have ever accomplished before, to be confident but also tolerant, and rich but also generous, to be willing to teach but also willing to learn, to be powerful but also wise. I believe that America is capable of all of these things, but I also believe it is falling short of them. Gradually but unmistakably, we are succumbing to the arrogance of power. The measure of our falling short is the measure of the patriot's duty of dissent." Johnson believed the lecture to be personally directed against him and used the White House reception to object to the characterization. Fulbright wrote a conciliatory message to Johnson insisting that he was not referring to him but instead to nations in hope that this country, presently the greatest and the most powerful in the world, may learn by the mistakes of its predecessors. "I believe that under your leadership we will avoid similar mistakes." This failed to appease Johnson, the president giving speeches in Washington and Chicago expressing disdain for the senator's views. He still believed it essential to have a working relationship with Fulbright and invite him to a fundraiser in Houston, but a previous engagement kept him from coming. Johnson met with Fulbright in the White House on June 1st. The conversation lasted almost 2 hours and was dominated by Johnson, who reviewed the options open to him and explained how he was acting in the national interest. Fulbright stated that he was still not confident in the administration's policy, but also intended to keep in contact with LBJ. Fulbright attending 3 White House ceremonies over the next 2 weeks, including one where Johnson greeted him warmly as an old friend, put his arm around the senator and talked animatedly for several seconds. The two had a private discussion in which Fulbright characterized Johnson as reverting to a highly emotional harangue. The president stated his intent to apply enough military might to force the communists into settling, and Fulbright noted that he had never seen Johnson so insecure and phonetic. The disturbed Fulbright returned to Capitol Hill very troubled, telling members of his staff the president was beyond a rational discussion of Vietnam and worried that Johnson in that mood was capable of almost any recklessness. In April, Senator Russell sat for an interview in the U.S. News and World Report, where he called for the withdrawal of American troops from South Vietnam in the event its people were found to be anti-American. On his past opposition to going into Vietnam, Russell said, I opposed the decision to go into Vietnam before the commitment was made to the government of South Vietnam 12 years ago. But after our forces and our flags were committed, I have loyally supported my country's policy. I know of no honorable alternative for any American. Russell said that he thought we should bomb any and all military and strategic targets in North Vietnam that may contribute to the communist campaign of tyranny and aggression against the South. On April 28th, Johnson sent a message to Congress calling for more civil rights legislation. I asked the Congress first to reform our federal criminal statutes to provide Negroes and all who labor or speak for racial justice the protection of stronger and more effective criminal laws against interference with the exercise of long-established rights. Second, to establish detailed procedures of jury selection in federal courts so that discrimination may be banished, and to create forceful guarantees that state court juries also will be selected without discrimination of any kind. Third, to broaden the Attorney General's authority to bring suit for the desegregation of schools and public facilities, enabling him to commit the government's legal resources where they are most critically needed. Fourth, to declare a national policy against racial discrimination in the sale or rental of housing and to create effective remedies against that discrimination in every part of America. In May, roughly 350 University of Chicago students took control of the administration office building as part of their protest of the university's compliance with the selective service system. The protest kept the university president and other top officials from their desk, leaving the demonstrators with free run of the building. Professor Gerard E. Omeyer, an economist who left Germany in 1933, called the sit-in a self-defeating tactic and claimed his experience made him oppose politicization of a university from within or without. University President George W. Beadle released a statement mockingly read by one of the protesters. I regret this sit-in, which, along with other coercive tactics, is unacceptable in a university devoted to inquiry and discussion. Johnson opened his May 21st press conference with a statement on Vietnam. We are watching the situation in Vietnam very closely. We believe everything possible should be done to bring the various factions to an understanding of the need for unity while the constitutional process is moving forward. That is what our people are trying to do. General Westmoreland and Ambassador Lodge are both in Vietnam now. We are in very close contact with them by cable, and our lower level people have other communication. The South Vietnamese are trying to build a nation. They have to do this in the teeth of communist efforts to take over by force. It is a hard and a frustrating job, and there is no easy answer. No instant solution to any of the problems they face. We are not in Vietnam to dictate what form of government they should have. We have made it abundantly clear that it is our wish to see them increasingly able to manage their own affairs with the participation of an ever broader share of the population. We regret any diversion from that task and from efforts to defeat the communist attempt to take over South Vietnam. I will, of course, during the day and the week, and all the time that I am in this office until we have a satisfactory solution of our problems in that area of the world, be in close touch with the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Rostow, and other experts, both here and out there. Dalek writes, at the end of May, Johnson saw reason to sit out the elections. A chart on results from presidential efforts and off-year campaigns gave no reason to get significantly involved. Moreover, current polls suggested little that he could do to reverse party fortunes. His popularity continued to fall. Worries about inflation, Vietnam, and his proposal to bar racial discrimination in the sale or rental of private housing were further reducing his attractiveness to voters. Likewise, the Democrats, who had a 21-point advantage over the Republicans in November 1965 as the party best able to handle national problems, held only a 7-point edge over the GOP in May. It was the closest the margin had been since August 1960, when the two parties had been nearly even. The result of this question over the years had been a good indicator of voter sentiment and suggested that the Republicans might gain as many as 50 or even 60 House seats and 2 in the Senate, where there were 35 races. On June 1st, leadership of the White House Conference on Civil Rights yielded to militants to permit votes on resolutions that could embarrass the administration. National Director of the Congress of Racial Equality, Floyd McKissick, and other delegates worked to oppose the administration's move to have no parliamentary procedures in the two-day conference. Johnson made an unannounced appearance in the evening and requested they not expect centuries of mistreatment to be undone by one man or administration. Do not expect from me or any man a miracle. Do not expect us even together to put right in 1 year or 4 all that took centuries to make wrong. He brought the delegates to their feet for an ovation when he said, I do pledge this, to give my days and such talents as I have been given to the pursuit of justice and opportunity for those so long denied them. Johnson also introduced Solicitor General Thurgood Marshall ahead of the latter's speech. After the conference's conclusion, some felt that the recommendations were so vague and broad that they did not provide a mandate for either Johnson or Congress, though the president was noted for keeping as uncertain an element as the civil rights movement under control during the conference. On June 3rd, Governor Wallace met with 18 university and college presidents in Alabama, the group endorsing his opposition to federal government school desegregation guidelines. The statement said in part, "These illegal guidelines, which go far beyond the letter and spirit of the law, threaten the ultimate destruction of the public educational system of the state of Alabama and the nation, and are a further attack on states' rights and local government by an irresponsible federal bureaucracy." In mid-July, Chicago had several nights of riots in a West Side ghetto. Governor Otto Kerner toured the armories in a visit with troops and declined calling them off until Mayor Daley and the Chicago police superintendent decided police could handle the incident without help. Kerner claimed the mobilization was costing $100,000 a day. Martin Luther King called the riot the result of a lack of recreational facilities in the area. On August 6, King joined 600 civil rights demonstrators in a march to protest segregated housing in a white residential area. They were escorted by a police force of 900 officers, who protected them from being critically injured during the march. The white mob attacking vehicles with stones, firecrackers, and bottles. Blacks shielded King with their bodies during the march. The man directly in front of King left dazed and bleeding after a stone struck his nose. The white crowd assembled in Marquette Park, initially composed of hundreds of teenagers, many of whom were waving Confederate flags and banners saying "Elect George Wallace, the governor of Alabama president." By the time the marchers reached a park at 5 p.m., over 25 policemen escorted King from his car to the staging area as a volley of stones and bottles flew over them, King being struck by a stone that left him with a visible knot around his right ear. King said, "I've never seen anything like it in my life. I think the people from Mississippi ought to come to Chicago to learn how to hate." A week later, Humphrey participated in a television interview where he agreed with Archbishop of Chicago, Reverend John P. Cody, on a temporary halt on civil rights marches in Chicago. He called for closer cooperation between citizens and law enforcement and said demonstrators had created resentment among whites toward the cause of social justice. On July 4, 1966, Johnson signed the Freedom of Information Act, revising the third section of the Administration's Procedural Act to give guidelines for federal department and agency records. Johnson said the bill sprang from one of our most essential principles: a democracy works best when the people have all the information that the security of the nation permits. No one should be able to pull curtains of secrecy around decisions, which can be revealed without injury to the public interest. In the first half of July, once Americans became aware of the stepped-up air war, their hopes for a quick end to fighting soared, and support for Johnson's Vietnam policy went from 42% to 54%. 86% of Americans were found to believe that the bombing would get it over with in Vietnam fairly soon by either military victory or negotiations. It would not be long before such hopes were dashed. 2 months after the POL strikes started, military planners described the bombing as not having a significant impact on the Hanoi economy, will to fight, or capacity to move men and supplies to the south. An analysis of the fighting by the U.S. in Saigon painted a bleak picture, as it concluded that a decisive military victory for either side was not likely. On August 8, the New York Times reported that a Pentagon study had found it would take another 8 years to win the war if the U.S. did not increase its forces to 750,000, which would decrease the number of years to 5. A Defense Department study that month with 4 former science advisors to the government reported the bombing as having little impact on North Vietnam, and that there was no reason to believe an expansion of the air war or mining the harbors of Hanoi would bring better results. The scientists found that with very few exceptions, our information on communist logistics and manpower was so inexact that it was difficult to come to any conclusions as to the effectiveness of our military policy. It is not an exaggeration to say that the data is so soft that we cannot state with confidence whether we have been doing better or worse militarily over the past year. Dalek writes that Johnson was unwilling to concede these realities. On July 14th, Johnson and Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt shared toast at the White House, LBJ calling them partners in the formation of the Asian Development Bank, the Mekong River Delta, and in denying those who would destroy the promise of stability and growth, and in encouraging those who would make that promise a reality. On August 1st, Charles Whitman journeyed to the main building tower of the University of Texas at Austin. He fired indiscriminately, killing 15 people until 2 Austin Police Department officers fatally shot him an hour and a half after he had first opened fire. This was the deadliest mass shooting in American history at the time. Johnson telegrammed University of Texas Chancellor Dr. Harry Ransom offering the first couple's condolences and extending any personal or professional help needed. Bill Moyers read a statement by the president the following day, declaring the lesson from the shooting was that it was time for the passage of legislation to help prevent the wrong persons from obtaining firearms. On August 24th, Johnson signed the Animal Welfare Act, a regulation on animal treatment by research facilities and dealers. The president argued that science and research do not compel us to tolerate the kind of inhumanity which has been involved in the business of supplying stolen animals to laboratories, or which is something involved in the careless and callous handling of animals in some of our laboratories. On September 1st in Dayton, Ohio, Lester Mitchell was shot in the face while sweeping his porch. Witnesses said 3 whites were in the car that fired the shot and a racial riot began, most of it taking place in the Big West Side area where over 90% of the city's black population resided. The fire department reported 5 minor fires started by arsonists, 2 of which were triggered with firebombs. The 24-hour upheaval in the town of about 275,000 ended with 1 death, 30 injuries, and 130 arrests. Johnson had been scheduled to visit the city at a rally the following week. Chief of Police Lawrence Kaler regarding the president's possible visit as uncertain after the incident. At a news conference on September 21st, Johnson was asked of his assessment of the war and whether it would be finished by June 1967. I don't think I can add much to what you already know, and whatever I said, I think would probably be held against me if I didn't just hit it on the nose. I think you can observe from the papers each day what is happening. Admiral Sharp and General Westmoreland think that we are going about as they have expected. They are very pleased with the successes that our men have achieved out there. They feel very good about the results they have been able to obtain. We have definite plans that we believe will be achieved, but just to say precisely what day these plans will be achieved is a very difficult thing in war. I don't think any commander-in-chief has ever been able to do that. We seek peace. We would like to see the shooting stop tomorrow. We would like to talk this thing out instead of fighting it out. But as I have said so many times, unless the aggressor is willing to give up his aggression and sit down and talk, we have no choice except to try to defend and to protect these liberty-loving free people. We are going to do that, and how long the aggressor will maintain his aggression will depend on his decision more than ours. By October, the New York Times observed the Senate probably offered the President and the State Department more foreign policy advice than any Senate since World War II. There were speeches, statements, sense of the Senate resolutions, even educational hearings. Whether as a result of all of this, Congress and again, particularly the Senate-influenced policy, will be a matter for historians to debate, but there is no question about the Senate having asserted itself. Nixon campaigned for Republicans in the midterms, the only national-profile Republican to do so, and focused on the South. Nixon told a Fort Lauderdale auditorium, "I've seen some of those Democratic birds flying out of Washington. Lyndon is flying around electing his candidates for 1966. Bobby is flying around lining up his delegates for 1968. But poor Hubert, he's just flying around." Observers believe that Nixon was possibly considering running for president again in 2 years. His camp saying that he was making no effort to line up delegates in exchange for his services, and Nixon himself said that any talk of a presidential run would damage party unity. In 1966, as the midterms approached their final month, Republicans seized on civil rights as a campaign issue. Committee Chairman Ray C. Bliss told a conference that 58% of Americans considered civil rights one of the most important issues domestically, noting that there was a 14% increase from a similar poll taken 4 months earlier. The coordinating committee issued a statement reading in part, "Unfortunately, the Johnson-Humphrey administration has accomplished nothing of substance to date to promote public safety. Indeed, high officials of this administration have condoned and encouraged disregard for law and order." Former President Eisenhower weighed in as he admitted the public was justifiably angry about the increased crime and violence. I think the Republicans ought to take the strongest possible position and pledge to remove this curse. By the beginning of October, there were preliminary government estimates of the Vietnam War increasing the yearly rate of defense spending by $3 billion, the largest increase in a quarter since the war began. The $60 billion in defense purchases of goods and services in the July to September quarter marked the first time the $60 billion amount had been reached since World War II. Johnson held a press conference on October 6th, being asked about the race question outpacing Vietnam as the key campaign issue and his assessment on those issues as well as the handling of them by both his administration and the Republicans. I think that every person will draw his own conclusion about the section of the country he is in and the local issues that may exist. I have no doubt, but what our full employment program, our Vietnam engagement, our domestic problems, including our civil rights problems, will all play a part in some of the campaigns. I think it will differ from place to place and candidate to candidate. I think the 89th Congress, which is made up of both Democrats and Republicans, but predominantly Democrats, has been a very effective and productive Congress in the field of education. It has passed 18 far-reaching educational measures, 24 health measures. It has passed more educational measures this Congress than all the other 88 Congresses combined. I believe that most of the members of that Congress will return home with a very fine record to support them, and I think that most of them will be reelected. The New York Times responded to the press conference. There is a question that could have been, but was not, asked at the president's meeting with the press yesterday. Can the United States steadily escalate the war in Vietnam, prepare for a still bigger war next year, and at the same time bring about peace negotiations with Hanoi? Peace offers with one hand, killing, burning, deflating, destroying, bombing with the other. The result, surely, is to cancel out each other's effectiveness. There can be no doubt that the fundamentals of President Johnson's policy, as formulated by Ambassador Goldberg at the United Nations, still stand. The United States is not seeking territory, nor the destruction of the Hanoi government, nor permanent bases in South Vietnam. It is prepared to cease bombing North Vietnam and withdraw American troops if Hanoi makes comparable concessions. On October 14th, McNamara sent Johnson a memorandum on his belief that there was no reasonable way to bring the war to an end soon. Operation Rolling Thunder, in the view of the intelligence community, significantly affected infiltration of South Vietnam, nor cracked the morale of Hanoi. McNamara foresaw the war ending in a satisfactory conclusion within the next 2 years, and concluded that the solution lied in grinding for a longer war and in taking actions that will, in 12 to 18 months, give clear evidence that the continuing costs and risks to the American people are acceptably limited, that the formula for success has been found, and that the end of the war is merely a matter of time. The following day, Johnson signed a bill creating the Department of Transportation. He said, "Transportation is the biggest industry we have in this country. It involves one out of every $5 in our economy. Our system of transportation is the greatest of any country in the world, but we must face facts. We must be realistic. We must know, and we must have the courage to let our people know that our system is no longer adequate. During the next 2 decades, the demand for transportation in this country is going to more than double, but we are already falling far behind with demand as it is. Our lifeline is tangled. Today we are confronted by traffic jams. Today we are confronted by commuter crises, by crowded airports, by crowded airplanes, by crowded airlanes, by screeching airplanes, by archaic equipment, by safety abuses and roads that scar our nation's beauty. We have come to this historic East Room of the White House today to establish and to bring into being a Department of Transportation, the second cabinet office to be added to the President's cabinet in recent months." In an article titled "Victory in Vietnam," the New York Times wrote, "In short, it is clear that the United States cannot lose in the military sense, clear not only to the American and Vietnamese people, but to all the world. In so strong a position as this, the United States is in an ideal posture now to stop the bombing of North Vietnam, without any possibility of suspicion that such a move could be derived from weakness. President Johnson is firmly and emotionally on record, both before he left the United States and during his present trip, as refusing to consider a unilateral pause. If it seems fruitless to urge on him something that he emphatically says he will not do, one has only to consider the variety and quality of those who are suggesting a bombing pause today. These are men who know perfectly well what Mr. Johnson has said and how he feels. They include Pope Paul VI, Hugh Thant, Secretary General of the United States, Professor Reischauer, who has just returned from his distinguished service as United States Ambassador to Japan, Chester Ronning, Canada's respected envoy on diplomatic missions to Hanoi, and many others, including the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Both communist and non-communist statesmen, with connections in Hanoi and no desire to see the war continue to China's profit alone, are saying the same thing. The rationale behind this pressure is, first, the conviction that unless the bombing is stopped, there will be no peace negotiations, and second, that even though it is uncertain that the cessation will lead to anything better, at least a unilateral, unconditional stop to the bombing offers the possibility that Hanoi might respond. The situation today is quite different from that which existed during the last bombing pause, and it is conceivable that the results could be different too. Johnson ended the campaign season with a message urging citizens to vote. On Wednesday, when the results are in and the winners have celebrated and the losers have conceded, the issues will remain. We will still face the great questions of war and peace and of providing a better life for our people, of caring for those in need. We will not have provided any final answers to those questions when we vote on Tuesday. What we will have done is decide who will try to answer those questions in the name of the people. We will have entrusted to some men and denied to other men the authority and responsibility for the conduct of our public business. The citizens of a democracy have no graver task than this, nor any prouder right. Generations ago, Americans were willing to sacrifice their lives and fortunes to secure the vote. In our own time, men have marched and prayed and sung to win it, and exercised it, often at great risk to themselves. It is precious and powerful. It is our protection against tyranny and bad government. It is the instrument of peaceful change. It is the way we express our views on the most important questions we face as a people. But it is not self-exercising. The right to vote is only an abstraction if it is not used. The man and woman who stay at home tomorrow will have the right to vote, but they will not have a part in choosing who shall lead them in the next few years. The wisest man who does not vote has less control over his destiny than the one who, though he may lack understanding, does go to the polls. Tomorrow we vote. The issues are important and complex. The choice of good men is critical. I urge you, my fellow Americans, to use the right that men have died for, and that is your own voice in the future of your country. Tomorrow, vote. The November 1966 midterms saw the Democrats lose 47 seats in the House and 3 in the Senate, though the party retained its majorities in both chambers. The midterm notably saw Democrat Maureen Nauberg, the only woman ever elected to the Senate from Oregon, replaced by Mark Hatfield. Tennessee Democrat Ross Bass replaced by Republican and future Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker. Illinois Democrat Paul Douglas defeated for re-election by Charles H. Percy, and Republican Edward Brooke becoming the first African-American elected to the U.S. Senate since Reconstruction. At a press conference 2 days later, Johnson was asked about the election results, and he replied, "I think it will be more difficult for any new legislation we might propose. I think it is very clear that the House with 295 to 300 Democrats is more likely to approve Democratic recommendations than a House with 245 to 250. While I don't think it would make any great difference in the Senate, you do have a Senate that is reduced from 67 to 64. I told Mr. Christian, when he asked me yesterday about the election, that I thought we lost more seats in the Senate than we had anticipated. Very frankly, I don't like to ever recommend that we lose any, but I had anticipated a loss of not over 1 in the Senate, and we lost 3, although only 1 was an incumbent, Senator Douglas. The Oregon seat was a replacement for Senator Nauberg. The Tennessee seat was a replacement for Senator Bass. We thought that we would lose 1. We lost 3. It is pretty difficult to guess when they are voting on 435 people in 50 states what the result will be. But the number of losses in the House somewhat exceeded what our better people who had reports on it would indicate, although I was clear to point out that they received the reports from the candidates themselves. The margin was some 5 to 10 more than the total amount that we had anticipated, as I told you in a press conference the other day, and as I told you at Johnson City. On November 15th, Johnson entered Bethesda Naval Academy for corrective surgery on his abdomen and throat. Bill Moyers told the press that Johnson had lost several pounds, and Humphrey served as acting president during the 2 hours that Johnson was incapacitated. In December, Democratic governors met in West Virginia, and all but 2 of the nearly 20 of them agreed that Democratic losses were directly tied to growing national disillusion with the Johnson administration. Chairman of the Democratic Governor Caucus, Harold Hughes, said state leaders agreed they need to play a larger role in party policy, and the group was in agreement of the Great Society programs moving too rapidly, particularly federal anti-poverty and education programs that they felt were being imposed on states without thought for how they would be implemented. When asked if Johnson could win re-election, Hughes said, "I don't know. You would have to know what his opposition was. But I would say that if he had a respectable opponent who was acceptable to the American people, he would have a very tough race." Hughes noted that no one suggested dropping Johnson for another candidate or had specifically named Robert Kennedy. The meetings were significant for being the first time major party figures had laid blame at the White House's doorstep. In the last week of December, a military spokesman reported that in the 5 years since the first service member had died in Vietnam, 6,000 1,407 Americans had been killed in the conflict. On Christmas Eve, Johnson asked President of the World Bank, George Woods, to lead in persuading other nations to help with the Indian food crisis. Dalek writes, as the year ended, Johnson's credibility, his willingness to be honest with the press, the public, and Congress had become a bigger issue than his extraordinary legislative gains or Democratic Party defeats. And central to so many doubts about the president's reliability was his direction of the war in Vietnam, which was becoming the country's greatest concern. In my own opinion, 1966 is probably the least important year of the Johnson presidency. You have two major laws, the Freedom of Information Act and the Transportation Department, and no major events relating to his handling of Vietnam. The real significance of this year is the slowing down of the Great Society programs, the shift of lawmakers to being more critical of his handling of Vietnam, with RFK and Fulbright being the most prominent from the outset, and the losses in the midterm election, which are not that large, but nonetheless served as immediate confirmation the Republicans were not done following their crushing defeat in 1964, and foreshadows the party's capture of the White House 2 years later. No longer is Johnson the activist, veteran lawmaker president trying to help the poor or the minority. He is now the ill-advised foreign invader, sending Americans to their deaths over a war most of them couldn't care less about. The New Deal coalition, which he had first been elected to Congress under the banner of, is beginning its disintegration. Franklin Roosevelt claimed to have not pursued civil rights legislation so as not to break with Southerners who supported his other programs. Johnson has embraced civil rights wholeheartedly, but not the anti-war cause, and that, along with the division over the implementation of his Great Society programs, is starting to tear the Democratic Party apart. He is out-lefted by RFK and out-Southerned by Wallace. This is the beginning of his presidency's erosion.